In the basement of Boston General Hospital, Dr. Marcus Whitfield had constructed a machine that could extract human emotions with surgical precision. The device, built from copper wires and glass chambers, could drain a patient's capacity for love, fear, or joy, preserving these feelings in crystalline vials that glowed with their own inner light. Before we dive deeper into Dr. Whitfield's horrifying experiments and the machine that could steal human emotions, make sure you're subscribed to Twisted Truth Tales, because we're about to uncover one of the most disturbing medical mysteries in American history. Hit that like button if you're ready to explore the darkest corners of psychiatric innovation, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our spine-chilling historical investigations. Now let's return to Boston in 1893, where the boundaries between healing and horror were about to be crossed in ways that would challenge everything the medical community believed about the human mind. Boston in 1893 stood at the forefront of American medical innovation, its hospitals and research institutions attracting the most brilliant minds from across the United States and Europe. The city's medical district, centered around Massachusetts General Hospital and the recently established Boston Medical College, represented the pinnacle of scientific advancement in treating disorders of the human mind and body. It was within this environment of cutting-edge research and intellectual ambition that Dr. Marcus Whitfield would create the most extraordinary and terrifying breakthrough in the history of psychiatric medicine. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had arrived in Boston in the spring of 1890, carrying impeccable credentials from the University of Vienna and letters of recommendation from some of Europe's most respected neurologists and alienists. At 42 years old, he possessed the perfect combination of youthful energy and mature expertise that made him immediately attractive to Boston's medical establishment. His specialty was the treatment of emotional disorders, a field that conventional medicine had barely begun to understand, much less effectively treat. Whitfield's appearance commanded immediate respect and attention wherever he went. Standing 6 feet tall with perfectly groomed silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, he moved through Boston's social and professional circles with the confidence of a man who understood secrets that others could only guess at. His voice carried traces of a refined European accent that suggested sophisticated international education, while his knowledge of the latest developments in neurology and psychology seemed to exceed that of physicians who had spent their entire careers studying these subjects. The private clinic that Dr. Whitfield established on Beacon Hill, just a few blocks from the State House, quickly became one of Boston's most exclusive and sought-after medical facilities. The building itself was a magnificent 4-story brownstone that Whitfield had purchased and extensively renovated to serve as both his residence and his medical practice. The ground floor featured elegant consultation rooms decorated with the finest European furniture and medical instruments, while the upper floors housed private treatment chambers for patients requiring extended care and observation. What none of Whitfield's patients or colleagues knew was that the basement had been converted into something far more extraordinary than a simple storage area or additional treatment space. Working in complete secrecy over the course of 18 months, Whitfield had constructed a laboratory that combined the precision of scientific research with the ambition of alchemical experimentation. The centerpiece of this hidden facility was the emotion extraction device, a machine so far ahead of its time that modern psychology would not develop comparable technology for more than a century. The emotion extraction device stood nearly 10 feet tall, constructed primarily of polished brass and copper with intricate clockwork mechanisms that suggested both mechanical precision and organic complexity. Multiple glass chambers of varying sizes were connected by a network of thin copper tubes that created a circulatory system, allowing extracted emotions to flow between different components of the machine. Each chamber was equipped with crystalline storage vials that could preserve specific emotional states in their pure form, maintaining their integrity and potency across extended periods of time. The most remarkable feature of Whitfield's apparatus was its ability to identify, isolate, and extract specific emotional responses while leaving other aspects of the patient's psychological makeup intact. Using a combination of electrical stimulation, chemical intervention, and what he called psychic resonance, the machine could target particular emotional memories and experiences, drawing them out of the patient's consciousness and transferring them to the storage vials where they could be preserved, studied, and potentially transferred to other subjects. Dr. Whitfield's first successful experiment in emotion extraction had been conducted on himself during the winter of 1891. Using a modified version of his device, he had carefully removed and stored his own recollections of a deeply traumatic childhood experience involving the death of his younger sister in a house fire. The procedure had eliminated not only the specific memory but also the profound guilt and sorrow that had haunted him for over 30 years. The extracted emotions were preserved in a single crystalline vial that seemed to glow with a warm, golden light. More importantly, Whitfield discovered that the extracted emotions retained their essential characteristics and could be studied as independent phenomena. By carefully adjusting the machine's settings, he could re-experience his own removed emotions as if they were foreign substances being introduced to his consciousness. The implications were staggering. Human emotional experience, Whitfield realized, was not an indivisible aspect of consciousness, but a collection of discrete psychological states that could be separated, catalogued, and redistributed like chemical compounds in a laboratory. The first patient to undergo Whitfield's emotion extraction procedure was Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, a 38-year-old widow who had been suffering from severe melancholia following the death of her husband in a railroad accident. Morrison had sought treatment from multiple physicians without relief, and her condition had deteriorated to the point where she was unable to care for herself or her 3 young children. When conventional therapies failed, her family brought her to Dr. Whitfield as a last resort. Whitfield's treatment of Eleanor Morrison represented a breakthrough in what he privately called psychic surgery. Rather than attempting to help the patient process her grief through conversation or medication, Whitfield proposed to simply remove the traumatic emotions that were causing her psychological distress. The procedure, he explained to Morrison's family, would involve the targeted extraction of specific emotional memories while leaving the patient's general personality and other psychological functions intact. The extraction process required 3 separate sessions, each lasting approximately 6 hours. Morrison was connected to the emotion extraction device through copper conductors that were carefully positioned against specific points on her skull and temples. The machine's clockwork mechanisms would then activate, creating what Whitfield described as controlled psychic stimulation of the brain's emotional centers. As the procedure progressed, Morrison's extracted grief would flow through the copper tubes into crystalline storage vials, where it could be preserved indefinitely. The transformation in Eleanor Morrison was immediate and dramatic. After the final session, she emerged from the basement laboratory with no recollection of the emotional devastation that had followed her husband's death. Her melancholia had completely disappeared, replaced by a calm contentment that her family found both miraculous and deeply unsettling. Morrison retained all her factual memories of her husband and their life together, but the emotional significance of these experiences had been completely eliminated. Dr. Whitfield, meanwhile, had gained access to Morrison's extracted grief and found himself experiencing emotions and psychological states that belonged to another person's life. He could feel the profound love that Morrison had shared with her husband, experience the devastating shock of learning about the railroad accident, and understand the deep maternal anxiety about her children's welfare that had compounded her suffering. These borrowed emotions felt as real and immediate as his own experiences, yet he retained complete awareness that they originated from someone else's psychological history. The success of the Morrison case established Dr. Whitfield's reputation as Boston's leading specialist in emotional disorders. Word of his miraculous treatment spread through the city's social networks, and wealthy families began bringing their most troubled relatives to his Beacon Hill clinic. Each case provided Whitfield with new opportunities to refine his techniques and expand his understanding of how human emotions could be manipulated, extracted, and preserved. Margaret Sullivan's case represented the culmination of Dr. Whitfield's first year of experimentation with emotion extraction. Unlike his previous patients, who had suffered from specific traumatic experiences, Sullivan presented with what Whitfield classified as comprehensive emotional dysfunction. She had been experiencing what her family described as excessive emotional sensitivity that made her unsuitable for normal social interaction. She would weep uncontrollably at minor disappointments, become overwhelmed with joy at simple pleasures, and experience such intense empathy for others' suffering that she could not function in normal society. What made Margaret's case particularly interesting to Dr. Whitfield was not her symptoms but the extraordinary richness and intensity of her emotional experiences. As the daughter of a successful Boston merchant and an active participant in the city's charitable and cultural organizations, she possessed decades of complex emotional memories spanning family relationships, romantic attachments, artistic appreciation, and social engagement. Her emotions, Whitfield realized, represented a complete archive of upper-class feminine experience in late 19th century America. The extraction of Margaret Sullivan's emotions required the most sophisticated application of Whitfield's technology to date. Rather than targeting specific traumatic events, he attempted to perform what he called comprehensive emotional harvesting. The procedure, conducted over 8 sessions spanning 3 weeks, involved the systematic removal of virtually all of Margaret's emotional responses while leaving her cognitive functions and factual memories intact. The results exceeded even Whitfield's ambitious expectations. Margaret emerged from the treatment as a functional human being capable of speech, reasoning, and social interaction, but completely devoid of emotional response to any stimulus. She could discuss her family, friends, and interests with perfect accuracy and appropriate social behavior, but showed no emotional connection to any aspect of her previous life. She had been transformed into what Whitfield privately termed a perfect social automaton, capable of all the behaviors expected of a proper Boston lady, while experiencing none of the emotional complications that had previously made her unsuitable for conventional society. Whitfield, conversely, now possessed complete access to Margaret Sullivan's extracted emotional experiences. He could feel her childhood wonder at her first visit to the symphony, experience her romantic love for the young man she had been forbidden to marry, and understand her deep satisfaction in charitable work among Boston's poor. These borrowed emotions integrated with his own consciousness, creating a composite psychological identity that encompassed both his original personality and Margaret's complete emotional history. The psychological effects of possessing another person's emotions proved more complex than Whitfield had anticipated. While he retained intellectual awareness that these feelings belonged to Margaret Sullivan, the emotional content felt entirely authentic. He found himself experiencing maternal instincts despite never having children, feeling romantic attraction to men despite his own heterosexual orientation, and possessing aesthetic sensitivities to music and art that had never been part of his original personality. More disturbing still was Whitfield's growing realization that the extracted emotions were not simply passive experiences that he could observe objectively. Margaret's emotions came with their own behavioral impulses, social preferences, and moral judgments that gradually began influencing his decision-making and daily activities. Whitfield was not merely storing borrowed emotional experiences, he was becoming a composite being that incorporated elements of everyone whose emotions he had extracted. The investigation into Dr. Marcus Whitfield's emotion extraction operations revealed a web of victims whose psychological identities had been systematically plundered for purposes that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medical ethics and human dignity. Unlike conventional medical crimes, which typically resulted in physical harm or death, Whitfield's patients had been subjected to a form of violation that attacked the very core of their humanity. They remained alive and physically healthy, but had been robbed of the emotional experiences and responses that defined who they were as individuals. Dr. William Hammond, leading the psychological examination of Whitfield's former patients, documented the full scope of the damage in his comprehensive report to the Massachusetts Medical Society. The 200-plus individuals who had undergone emotion extraction represented a cross-section of Boston society, ranging from wealthy merchants and their families to middle-class professionals and working-class residents seeking treatment for various psychological ailments. The case of Eleanor Morrison, while the most thoroughly documented, was far from unique. Hammond's examination revealed that Whitfield had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for targeting specific types of emotional responses while leaving others intact. Some patients had lost only traumatic experiences, while others had been subjected to comprehensive extraction that removed virtually all emotional content from their psychological makeup. Margaret Sullivan, the young woman whose treatment had established Whitfield's reputation, represented what Hammond classified as complete emotional harvesting. Sullivan retained her intellectual abilities, social skills, and factual memories, but had completely lost the capacity for emotional experience. The precision of the extraction was remarkable. Sullivan could remember events from her childhood, describe her relationships with family and friends, and discuss her previous interests and activities, but she experienced no emotional connection to any of these memories. The psychological consequences of complete emotional extraction proved complex and disturbing. While Sullivan no longer experienced the overwhelming emotional sensitivity that had made her unsuitable for conventional social interaction, she had also lost the capacity for joy, love, empathy, and all other positive emotional experiences that gave meaning to human existence. Her family described her as pleasant but hollow, as if some essential part of her humanity had been surgically removed. James Whitmore, a 45-year-old banker who had sought treatment for anxiety related to financial pressures, had undergone what Whitfield termed selective emotional modification. The procedure had targeted Whitmore's capacity for worry and fear while preserving his other emotional responses. The extraction had indeed eliminated his anxiety, but it had also removed his ability to assess risk or feel appropriate caution in dangerous situations. Within months of his treatment, Whitmore had made a series of reckless business decisions that destroyed his bank and left him financially ruined. Dr. Hammond's examination of Whitmore revealed that the emotional extraction had been so precise that he could feel love for his family, enjoy social activities, and experience satisfaction from his work, but he could not feel concern about potential negative consequences of his actions. His emotional landscape had been surgically altered to remove specific psychological responses while leaving others intact, creating a personality that was fundamentally unbalanced despite appearing normal to casual observers. The case of Sarah Pemberton, a 28-year-old artist who had been brought to Whitfield by her parents for treatment of what they considered excessive artistic passion, demonstrated the doctor's willingness to extract emotions that families found inconvenient rather than medically problematic. Sarah had been a talented painter whose intense emotional responses to beauty, injustice, and human suffering had inspired her art, but made her difficult for her conservative family to manage. Whitfield's treatment of Sarah involved the extraction of what he classified as artistic emotions, her capacity for aesthetic inspiration, her empathy for social outcasts, and her passionate responses to beauty and injustice. The procedure succeeded in making Sarah more socially acceptable to her family, but it also eliminated her artistic abilities and left her incapable of the emotional experiences that had previously given her life meaning and purpose. Dr. Hammond's examination of Sarah revealed that she could still technically draw and paint, but her artwork had become mechanical and lifeless, lacking the emotional depth that had previously characterized her artistic expression. She could discuss art with appropriate vocabulary and demonstrate technical competence, but she could no longer feel the emotional responses that transformed technical skill into authentic artistic creation. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah's case was her awareness of what she had lost. Unlike patients who had been rendered emotionally vacant, Sarah retained enough emotional capacity to understand that something fundamental had been taken from her. She could remember the intensity of her previous emotional experiences and recognize that she was no longer capable of feeling them, creating a form of psychological torture that was perhaps worse than complete emotional elimination. Charles Morrison, a 52-year-old minister who had sought treatment for what he described as overwhelming empathy that interfered with his pastoral duties, had undergone extraction of his capacity for emotional connection to others' suffering. The procedure had indeed made him more effective at providing practical advice and spiritual guidance without becoming emotionally overwhelmed by his parishioners' problems, but it had also eliminated the compassion that had made him an effective spiritual counselor. The extraction of Morrison's empathetic responses had created a minister who could perform all the technical aspects of pastoral care while lacking the emotional understanding that made such care meaningful. His sermons became intellectually sophisticated, but emotionally cold. His counseling became practical, but lacking in human warmth, and his relationships with his congregation became professional but devoid of genuine caring. Dr. Hammond's examination revealed that Morrison was aware of the change in his personality and deeply troubled by his inability to feel concern for others' suffering. He could understand intellectually that people were in pain and could provide appropriate responses based on his training and experience, but he could no longer feel the emotional connection that had previously motivated his desire to help others. The systematic nature of Whitfield's emotion extraction operations became clear as investigators analyzed the complete collection of preserved emotions. The 300-plus crystalline vials represented a comprehensive archive of human emotional experience, carefully categorized according to their contents and potential value. Whitfield had created what amounted to a library of stolen feelings, with each vial containing the extracted essence of an individual's psychological identity. The organizational system Whitfield had developed revealed the scope of his ambitions. Emotions were classified by type, with separate collections for love, grief, fear, joy, anger, and artistic inspiration. Within each category, specimens were further organized by intensity, purity, and the social status of their original owners. The most valuable emotions, according to Whitfield's notes, were those extracted from individuals with particularly rich emotional lives or unique psychological characteristics. Perhaps most disturbing was Whitfield's collection of what he termed exotic emotions, emotional experiences that fell outside normal human categories. These vials contained the extracted feelings of individuals who had experienced extreme psychological states, mystical experiences, or unusual forms of consciousness. Whitfield had systematically sought out patients with unique emotional experiences, extracting their feelings not for therapeutic purposes, but to satisfy his own curiosity about the outer boundaries of human psychological experience. The investigation revealed that Whitfield had developed a sophisticated network for identifying potential victims with valuable emotional experiences. He had cultivated relationships with other physicians who would refer patients with interesting psychological conditions. He had advertised his services to wealthy families looking for solutions to relatives who displayed unconventional emotional responses. He had even recruited agents who would identify individuals with remarkable emotional lives and encourage them to seek treatment at his clinic. The targeting of victims followed patterns that revealed Whitfield's psychological profile and research interests. He showed particular interest in individuals with intense emotional experiences, extensive creative abilities, or unusual psychological characteristics. Women were disproportionately represented among his victims, possibly because Whitfield found female emotional experiences particularly fascinating, or because women were more easily convinced to undergo experimental psychological treatments. Age patterns among the victims suggested that Whitfield preferred patients between 20 and 50 years old, individuals who had accumulated substantial emotional experience but were still psychologically vital enough to provide high-quality extracted emotions. Elderly patients were avoided because their emotional responses might be diminished, while younger patients lacked the experiential depth that Whitfield valued. The social class distribution of victims revealed Whitfield's understanding of Boston's power structures. While he extracted emotions from patients across the economic spectrum, his most comprehensive procedures were performed on individuals with sufficient social standing to provide valuable emotional experiences, but insufficient power to investigate his activities effectively. Working-class patients provided basic emotional experiences, while upper-class victims contributed complex psychological states and refined aesthetic sensibilities. Dr. Hammond's psychological examination of the victims revealed long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate loss of specific emotions. Many patients showed signs of what he termed existential disorientation, a fundamental confusion about their own identity and place in the world. Without access to the emotional experiences that had shaped their personality development, these individuals struggled to maintain consistent behavior patterns or form meaningful relationships. The concept of informed consent, already poorly developed in 1890s medicine, had been completely absent from Whitfield's procedures. Patients had been told they were receiving treatment for their psychological conditions, but none had been informed about the true nature of emotion extraction or its permanent consequences. Many had undergone multiple procedures without understanding that each session would result in further loss of their emotional capacity. The families of victims faced their own unique trauma as they watched loved ones transform into emotionally vacant versions of their former selves. Parents could no longer connect with children who had lost the capacity for filial affection. Spouses found themselves married to individuals who could no longer experience romantic love or emotional intimacy. The social fabric of families and communities had been torn apart by Whitfield's manipulation of human emotional experience. The investigation uncovered evidence of Whitfield's methods for acquiring victims through deception and manipulation. He had developed relationships with charitable organizations serving Boston's poor, offering free treatment for individuals suffering from emotional disorders. These patients who lacked the resources to investigate his methods or challenge his procedures became sources of raw emotional material for his research and experimentation. Whitfield had also cultivated connections with Boston's cultural institutions, positioning himself as a specialist in treating artists, musicians, and writers who suffered from the emotional intensity that fueled their creative work. Many of Boston's most talented artists had undergone his treatments, emerging as technically competent but emotionally sterile versions of their former selves. The financial aspects of Whitfield's operation revealed the extent to which he had commercialized human emotional experience. Wealthy patients paid substantial fees for procedures that promised to eliminate inconvenient emotions or enhance desirable psychological characteristics. The fees varied based on the complexity of the extraction and the social status of the patient, with some procedures costing the equivalent of several years' wages for working-class families. More disturbing was evidence that Whitfield had begun selling extracted emotions to other parties interested in psychological experimentation. Correspondence found in his laboratory indicated regular communication with researchers in Europe and other American cities who were willing to pay substantial sums for access to preserved human emotional experiences. Whitfield had essentially created a black market in human feelings, treating extracted emotions as commodities to be bought and sold. The preservation technology that Whitfield had developed allowed extracted emotions to maintain their potency indefinitely, creating a permanent archive of human psychological experience that could be studied, transferred, or manipulated according to his research interests. Some vials contained emotions that had been extracted years earlier but remained as fresh and intense as the day they had been harvested from their original owners. Dr. Hammond's analysis of the preservation process revealed that Whitfield had made fundamental discoveries about the nature of human emotional experience that would not be understood by mainstream psychology for decades. The extracted emotions retained not only their original intensity, but also their associated memories, behavioral impulses, and psychological characteristics. They were not simply feelings but complete psychological states that included all the complex elements that make emotional experience meaningful. The manhunt for Dr. Marcus Whitfield became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in American history, involving federal marshals, international law enforcement cooperation, and coordination between medical institutions across multiple countries. However, the search was complicated by Whitfield's international connections and his possession of extracted emotions that gave him psychological insights and manipulative abilities that exceeded those of normal individuals. The investigation revealed that Whitfield had not been working in isolation, but had been part of an informal network of researchers investigating the manipulation of human consciousness through various experimental methods. Several European universities had been receiving regular reports from Whitfield about his progress in emotion extraction, and some had provided both funding and theoretical support for his research. Dr. Heinrich Müller of the University of Berlin had been one of Whitfield's most important correspondents, maintaining a regular exchange of letters that lasted for over 3 years. Muller's communications, intercepted by investigators, revealed his fascination with Whitfield's ability to isolate and preserve specific emotional states. Muller had been conducting parallel research into memory manipulation and had been hoping to combine his techniques with Whitfield's emotion extraction methods. The correspondence between Whitfield and Muller revealed plans for establishing a comprehensive research program that would map the complete spectrum of human psychological experience through systematic extraction and analysis of emotions, memories, and other mental phenomena. The project would have created a psychological database that could be used to understand human consciousness in unprecedented detail, but at the cost of destroying the psychological integrity of hundreds or thousands of research subjects. The University of Vienna, where Whitfield had received his original training, launched its own investigation into the theoretical foundations of emotion extraction research. The inquiry revealed that Whitfield had been part of a small group of graduate students who had developed an interest in the potential for direct intervention in psychological processes. While most of his colleagues had limited their research to theoretical speculation and animal subjects, Whitfield had apparently decided to pursue human experimentation without institutional oversight or ethical approval. The American response to the Whitfield case was particularly significant because of evidence that he had been in communication with researchers at several prominent American universities, including Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Pennsylvania. The revelation that American medical institutions had been aware of Whitfield's work created pressure for comprehensive reform of research oversight and ethical standards. William James of Harvard University, who had been following Whitfield's research with considerable interest, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain his correspondence with a man who had committed systematic psychological abuse. James had been intrigued by Whitfield's claims about emotion extraction, but had not realized the extent of the human experimentation involved in developing these techniques. The most credible sighting of Dr. Whitfield occurred in 1895 in Montreal, where Canadian authorities investigated reports of a European physician who was treating wealthy families for various psychological conditions using advanced techniques that he claimed to have developed in European research institutions. The physician, who used the name Dr. Martin Wainfield, possessed medical equipment that seemed consistent with emotion extraction technology. When Canadian authorities attempted to investigate the Montreal clinic, they found it abandoned, with evidence suggesting a hasty departure similar to the pattern established in Boston. However, they discovered documentation indicating that the Montreal operation had been more sophisticated than the Boston clinic, incorporating new techniques for emotion transfer and psychological reconstruction that suggested continued development of Whitfield's original research. Additional reports placed Whitfield in San Francisco in 1897, where he had apparently established another emotion extraction facility serving wealthy clients seeking psychological enhancement or emotional modification. The San Francisco operation was discovered after several prominent families reported personality changes in relatives who had received treatment from a European psychiatrist specializing in advanced emotional therapy. The San Francisco laboratory, when finally located by federal investigators, contained the most advanced emotion extraction equipment that had ever been discovered. The technology incorporated improvements and refinements that indicated years of continued research and development since Whitfield's departure from Boston. The facility contained over 500 preserved emotional specimens, representing the largest collection of extracted human feelings ever assembled. Dr. Whitfield himself was found dead in the San Francisco laboratory, apparently having died several weeks before the facility was discovered. The circumstances of his death remained mysterious, but evidence suggested he had been conducting emotion extraction procedures on himself at the time of his death. His body was found connected to an advanced version of the extraction device, and several crystalline vials near his workstation contained what appeared to be his own preserved consciousness. The discovery of Whitfield's final laboratory provided investigators with unprecedented access to his complete research records and the most advanced emotion extraction technology ever developed. The scientific implications were extraordinary, but the ethical questions raised by his work continued to challenge the medical community's understanding of appropriate research boundaries and the treatment of human subjects. Dr. James Mitchell of the University of Pennsylvania, who led the scientific analysis of the San Francisco materials, discovered that Whitfield had made significant advances in emotion manipulation during his years as a fugitive. He had developed techniques for transferring extracted emotions between individuals, essentially allowing personality traits and psychological characteristics to be redistributed among different people. The implications of emotion transfer technology were staggering. Whitfield had created the theoretical foundation for completely reconstructing human personality by combining emotional elements from multiple sources. A patient could potentially receive the artistic sensibilities of one person, the intellectual curiosity of another, and the emotional stability of a third, creating composite personalities that incorporated the best psychological characteristics of multiple individuals. However, the practical applications of emotion transfer had proven more dangerous than Whitfield had anticipated. His research notes revealed numerous failed experiments in which attempts to combine incompatible emotional elements had resulted in severe psychological instability or complete mental breakdown. The human mind, it appeared, was not designed to accommodate emotional experiences that had not been developed through personal history and individual psychological development. The preservation of Whitfield's own consciousness in crystalline vials raised unprecedented questions about the nature of death and the possibility of psychological survival beyond physical existence. Several researchers reported evidence suggesting that the vials containing Whitfield's extracted consciousness showed patterns of activity consistent with ongoing mental processes, but ethical constraints prevented detailed investigation of these phenomena. The legal consequences of the Whitfield case extended far beyond criminal prosecution, influencing the development of medical ethics and establishing new categories of crime that addressed violations of psychological integrity. The concept of emotional theft was formally recognized as a distinct criminal offense, comparable to kidnapping or assault, but involving the stealing of psychological rather than physical aspects of human identity. The case also established important precedents for international cooperation in criminal investigation, as authorities recognized that crimes involving advanced psychological techniques could easily cross national boundaries. The protocols developed for tracking Whitfield and his associates became models for investigating other forms of international crime involving specialized knowledge and sophisticated technology. The philosophical implications of Whitfield's research continued to influence academic discourse long after his death. The demonstration that emotions could be extracted, preserved, and transferred raised fundamental questions about the nature of personal identity and the relationship between psychological experience and individual consciousness. If emotions could be moved from one person to another, what aspects of human identity were truly permanent and unchangeable? Religious communities struggled to incorporate the implications of emotion extraction into their theological frameworks. The possibility that human emotional experience could be separated from the individual soul challenged traditional concepts of spiritual identity and raised disturbing questions about the nature of psychological integrity and divine design. The medical community's long-term response to the Whitfield case involved a careful balance between maintaining ethical standards and pursuing legitimate research into human consciousness and emotional disorders. Theoretical work continued within appropriate ethical constraints, leading to significant advances in understanding the neurological basis of emotional experience and the treatment of psychological disorders. Educational institutions incorporated the Whitfield case into their curricula as a cautionary example of the potential consequences of unrestrained scientific ambition. Medical schools required students to study the case as part of their training in professional ethics, emphasizing the responsibility of physicians to protect patient welfare above all other considerations. The victims of Whitfield's experiments received varying degrees of support and compensation from medical institutions and government agencies. While their extracted emotions could never be restored, efforts were made to provide psychological counseling, financial assistance, and social support to help them rebuild their lives. Some victims developed coping strategies that allowed them to function effectively despite their emotional limitations, while others remained permanently disabled by the psychological consequences of their experiences. Margaret Sullivan, whose case had been most thoroughly documented, became an advocate for victims of medical experimentation and contributed to the development of patient protection standards. Despite her inability to experience emotions normally, she demonstrated remarkable intellectual resilience in building a new identity based on rational understanding rather than emotional connection. The families of Whitfield's victims faced long-term challenges in maintaining relationships with individuals who could no longer experience normal emotional connections. Support groups were established to help family members cope with the grief of losing loved ones who remained physically present but psychologically transformed. These groups contributed to better understanding of the social and emotional consequences of psychological trauma. The scientific legacy of Whitfield's work proved both valuable and dangerous. The theoretical principles underlying emotion extraction contributed to legitimate advances in neuroscience and psychology, but the practical techniques he had developed were considered too dangerous for further exploration. The tension between scientific curiosity and ethical responsibility became a defining characteristic of consciousness research for generations following the case. The preservation of Whitfield's research materials created ongoing dilemmas for the scientific community. The complete records of his emotion extraction procedures represented invaluable scientific data that could contribute to understanding of human consciousness and emotional function. However, the ethical problems associated with the research made it difficult to justify studying the materials even for legitimate scientific purposes. The international nature of Whitfield's crimes highlighted the need for global coordination in addressing emerging forms of scientific and medical crime. The protocols developed for investigating his activities became models for international cooperation in addressing other forms of technology-based criminal activity. The case contributed to the development of international legal frameworks for addressing crimes that transcended national boundaries. The mystery of the emotion harvester of Boston remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of psychological research. Dr. Marcus Whitfield's systematic extraction and manipulation of human emotions challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, consciousness, and the appropriate limits of medical intervention. His legacy continues to influence debates about medical ethics, the nature of human emotional experience, and the responsibilities of scientific researchers to protect the dignity and welfare of human subjects. The basement laboratory, where over 300 human emotions were preserved in crystalline vials, represented more than just a crime scene. It embodied the systematic commodification of human psychological experience and the transformation of individual emotional identity into objects of scientific curiosity. Each vial contained the extracted essence of a human soul, preserved for purposes that served Whitfield's ambitions rather than the welfare of his patients. The victims of his procedures lost not just specific emotional experiences but fundamental aspects of their humanity and psychological integrity. The case of the emotion harvester serves as a permanent warning about the potential dangers of scientific research conducted without appropriate ethical constraints and institutional oversight.